Many thanks for joining, dear viewers. You are watching OBN Horn of Africa. This is Future Africa program, and I'm Fantambelete hosting this program. Today I have very special guest with me here, author, veteran politician, and researcher on the Horn of Africa. This guest is Honorable Mr. Lencho Lata. Welcome to this program, and thank you for your time.
Thanks for inviting me.
Good. You have researched a lot on the Horn of Africa, and you have written a book entitled The Horn of Africa as Common Homeland, the State and Self-Determination. How do you relate your book with the current developments in the Horn of Africa?
Well, it is mostly what I predicted in the book that is happening in the Horn of Africa right now. The Horn of Africa is distinct from other sub-regions of Africa for a number of reasons. One, it is where self-determination is invoked in literally all the countries. The Horn of Africa, according to me, includes Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Somalia. As we know, Sudan is descending into state failure right now. And Somalia collapsed as a state more than 3 decades ago. And Eritrea emerged by separating itself from Ethiopia in 1991 effectively, but formally in 1993. So the Horn is distinct from the rest of Africa for state breakup. Eritrea broke up from Ethiopia in 1991 and then formalized it in the 1993 referendum. Sudan broke up much more recently, 2011. And whether the rest of the Sudan will still experience some more breakups is hard to tell right now. But conflicts are ongoing. This makes the Horn of Africa very distinct.
As a veteran politician who spent decades in the Ethiopian politics, how do you describe the price Ethiopia has paid for losing seaport?
Well, Ethiopia is the most populous landlocked country in the world. And this resulted as a consequence of European colonialism in this region. European colonialists deliberately wanted to deny Ethiopia access to the sea. And once Eritrea separated in 1993, Ethiopia became the most populous landlocked country in the world. And this is the issue that concerns not Ethiopia alone, but all the other countries of the Horn of Africa. Resolving conflicts in the Horn on a case-by-case basis has proven impossible to date. Therefore, I think there has to be a deliberation at the Horn level to deal with this and consequent problems.
Thank you. Ethiopia has recently inked Memorandum of Understanding with Somaliland. How do you understand or how do you feel this agreement?
The issue has become a very heated issue right now. And I think the focus should be Somaliland, not Ethiopia. The problem is between Mogadishu and Hargeisa, not between Addis Ababa and Mogadishu. I think the focus should be on Somaliland. How did Somaliland join the rest of Somalia? How did it separate? And why did it separate in 1991? These issues have to be discussed in detail. Somaliland joined former Italian Somaliland on July 1, 1960. But it gained its independence only 26 of June 1960, 4 days earlier. So it existed as a separate state for 4 days. But then they decided to move to Mogadishu. The parliamentarians, elected parliamentarians, traveled to Mogadishu, joined the other parliamentarians to create a larger Somalia. This was self-determination. This they discussed on behalf of the people who elected them to join Somalia. Then Somaliland spent roughly 30 years within Somalia and broke away in 1991 and declared its independence. This declaration of independence did not happen in a vacuum. After series of discussions, deliberations, they decided not to rejoin Somalia again. So it was a case of self-determination again. Joining was also self-determination, separating was also self-determination. What should be emphasized, I think, is what led them to withdraw their offer to join the rest of the Somalis was genocide, attempted genocide against the Isaac ethnic group by Siad Barre's government. Hargeisa was bombed, was leveled to the ground, and deliberate targeting of civilians was performed. Many fled to Ethiopia, neighboring Ethiopia. Therefore, they had a legitimate reason to separate from their former colleagues in Mogadishu. It is up to the Somalilanders today to explain and justify why they separated. This will not be accomplished by blaming Ethiopia. It's easy to blame Ethiopia because of traditional tension between Mogadishu and Addis Ababa. Therefore, I think we should refocus on Somaliland than dealing it as a conflict between Ethiopia and Somalia.
It shouldn't be focused on Ethiopia, rather Somalia and Somaliland should solve what they had.
I think the Somalis have to put their home in order. There is ATMIS right now, the international force that is stationed in Mogadishu, including Mogadishu and other places. The purpose of ATMIS is to defend the federal government from Somalis. Not our government is there to defend the citizens from harm, coming from inside or from outside. But in the case of Somalia, a foreign force was required to defend the government from Somalis. This ironic situation should be the focus of all attempts to resolve the conflict between Somaliland and the rest of Somalia.
In one of your recent interviews, you said the Memorandum of Understanding Ethiopia signed with Somaliland is not only historical, but it holds significant benefits in the geopolitics of the existing landscape in the Horn of Africa. What does that mean?
It is an attempt to agree to use resources in a mutually beneficial manner. Ethiopia simply needs access to the sea, and Somaliland has partly idle sea ports, and instead of letting the idle ports be a burden on Somaliland, Ethiopia has offered to use it for commercial and military purposes in a mutually beneficial manner. I think this is the beginning of a whole trend that should be encouraged for example, let us look at ports in the Horn of Africa. You can start from as north as Sudan, which has Port Sudan and other ports. Then follow Eritrea, it has Massawa and Assab. Then Djibouti. If we come to Somalia, it has a lot of ports that it does use. I think a region-wide approach to using these ports effectively must be adopted. I think it is feasible to create a Horn region corporation for the management and development of all these ports for the benefit of all the adjacent people, not only Ethiopia. And for this to happen, sovereignty has to be relaxed. One of the purposes for which I wrote this book is the sovereign state has proven fake in many instances in the rest of Africa, even more so in the Horn of Africa. And sovereignty is contested in the Horn of Africa. Although Eritrea has broken away from Ethiopia, there is still tension and conflict between the two. South Sudan has broken away from Sudan, but still there is tension between North and South Sudan. In order to resolve these issues, I think a case by case, one by one, will not lead to a sustainable resolution. I think a Horn-wide approach is necessary. For many of the ports are sitting idle because the societies that were supposed to use them have neither the need nor the capacity to use them. Much more importantly, they are unable to patrol the waters, their waters adjacent to these ports. As the result, their marine resources are being stripped by forces that come from far away. In order to avert this, a Horn-wide patrol should be instituted. I believe it is necessary to do that.
Dear audience, you are watching OBN Horn of Africa, Future Africa program with me, your host Fantaun Belete, and my special guest, Honorable Mr. Lencho Lata. Till the end of our program, stay with us, don't go anywhere. To make the Horn of Africa as common homeland, what has to be done? How should the leaders of the Horn of Africa and citizens living in that region come together or integrate Africa? And you will also tell us something about this book.
Well, I wrote this book in order to, I was engaged in the Oromo struggle for self-determination until I retired very recently. During this time, I have stayed in many of the Horn countries and realized that their challenges are very similar. For example, the Sudan was facing struggle in the southern third, which later on is split to the north in Darfur. Ethiopia, of course, hosted the largest number of movement for self-determination. It is to understand self-determination in the current era that I started reading literature, available literature. The end of the Cold War was occasioned the shift in a lot of ideas. So long as the Cold War existed, you allied yourself with one side, or you allied yourself with another one, and that sort of legitimated your struggle. Once the Cold War ended, the division, the division into two camps came to an end. There was a presumption that liberal democracy had triumphed. Is it true? Did liberal democracy triumph? Then self-determination would be as a course to arrive at a liberal democratic state. My readings showed that liberal democracy actually started to face new challenges after the Cold War came to an end. The other crisis that led me to read the material that resulted in the publishing of this book is the presumption that liberal democracy had triumphed. Fukuyama, I think it was, who said that we have arrived at the end of history, which indicated that there will not be conflicts anymore, but I couldn't agree with that. Is it true that liberal democracy has triumphed? Or did Marxism-Leninism in the style that implemented in the USSR and neighboring states collapsed. And this required rethinking a lot of issues, including the state. Self-determination is a mechanism for arriving at your own state. But existing states themselves are bankrupt, are unable to function as expected. And as a result of my research, I arrived at one important decision so far as the Horn of Africa is concerned. The fully homogenized, culturally, linguistically homogenized nation state should be given a decent burial. It is the pursuit of this homogeneous nation state that led to a lot of conflict in the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia being the primary one. Starting with the Emperor Selassie's time, the effort was to uphold homogenization by the coercive assimilation of those who are not from the Amhara ethnic group or not Amharic speakers. This has failed, and there are no truly the nation and the state coinciding happens very rarely. If efforts are made to turn every nation into a state, there will be more than 2,000 states worldwide. If we want to turn all states into nations, it would be less than 200. That means over 1,800 ethnic groups will have to disappear. That would be a tremendous loss to humanity, because what sets a nation apart from each other is language and culture. And every language has its peculiarities. It reflects centuries of humans trying to figure out their environment, naming their environment. And as a result, they are a pool of knowledge about the world itself. Destroying all these ethnic groups would be at a great loss to humanity.
To summarize the idea that you have inked in your book, what has to be read in that book?
Well, what results from this book is a region-wide approach to resolving conflicts. For example, the Somaliland-Somalia conflict cannot be resolved if you emphasize Ethiopia. It can be resolved only by creating institutions at the Horn level. I think one important, perhaps, step that can be taken to resolve the Somaliland-Somalia conflict within the Horn region is to create a Horn-wide assembly. And this cannot happen overnight. It has to be worked out very carefully. And for this to happen, the details of regional integration have to be worked out. Regional integration in the Horn of Africa cannot happen just like in other sub-regions of Africa. It has to be much deeper. There has to be political, economic, and cultural institutions. And for this to start happening, I think we should start deliberating on these issues openly and honestly and in depth. I think a Horn Institute is a must. I hope the crisis that has erupted between Somalia and Somaliland will occasion the birth of such an institution, an Horn-wide institution.
Is there anything you want to forward from or give us from your book? Any additional points that you want to raise?
I have already touched on it. My most important advice is that the pursuit of a homogeneous nation state should be given up. That cannot work. It can only lead to more turmoil, more conflict, more bloodshed.
Following the agreement that Ethiopia has made with Somaliland, many Ethiopians are showing their support and even for the leaders, and they also showed their interest to work with their brother nations of Somaliland. What should be done to further cement this people-to-people relation? And also, can you tell us the historical relationship of Somaliland people and people of Ethiopia?
Well, there is a love-hate relationship between Somalis and Ethiopians. They share a lot in common. At the same time, they have been at loggerheads for decades, primarily because of the ambition to realize Greater Somalia. Greater Somalia served also as the basis for consensus within Somalis between Somaliland and the rest of Somalia. They marched behind that agenda for decades and fought against Ethiopia in 1971, 77, 78. It is the frustration of this Greater Somalia that led to the breakdown of order in Mogadishu and the separation of Somaliland. I think unity based on opposition will lead to this kind of implosion unless it is handled very carefully. Instead of basing national unity on opposition, we must base it on the pursuit of justice, the pursuit of inclusive justice. Once that change has taken place, starting to resolve the conflict between Mogadishu and Hargeisa will prove much easier. Unless that is done, there is no reason why Somaliland should give up its freedom to join Somalia. Somalilanders have elected their own government in a credible democratic manner several times. I think the opposition from Mogadishu is not only opposition to Somaliland, it's also rejecting democracy. I think the controversy behind the ongoing turmoil is basically fear of democracy, which Somalilanders have adopted and adapted to their real situation and fit a state that reflects them, reflects their ambition, their profile in many ways.
Dear audience, you are watching OBN Horn of Africa, Future Africa program with me, your host Fantaun Belete, and my special guest, Honorable Mr. Lencho Lata. Till the end of our program, stay with us. His Excellency President Musa Bihi Abdi paid his first visit as a President of Republic of Somaliland to Ethiopia 5 years ago. And once he said, we see Ethiopia as an important and strategic partner and a good neighbor too. How far is this strategic relationship growing?
Frankly, I do not have the details, but the potential for cooperative relationship and the advantages of cooperating with each other are tremendous. For example, cattle from Somaliland at times need grazing land, and their most accessible grazing land is in eastern Ethiopia. This has to be granted and supported. Ethiopia, of course, needs access to the sea. It has been using Barbara to some extent until now. Now it is being upgraded to a different level. These kinds of cooperation, mutual cooperation, must be welcomed and encouraged.
Thank you. Somalia and some countries from near and far are opposing this agreement, the agreement that Ethiopia and Somaliland signed, that is Memorandum of Understanding. Why do they oppose? What diplomatic approach should Ethiopia follow to settle this issue peacefully?
I think Ethiopia should step out of the picture. Ethiopia's presence in this conflict will only complicate matters. This should be, the focus should be between Somaliland and the rest of Somalia. And how do we resolve the ongoing conflict in Somalia? I think the Horn of Africa should hold a sustained discussion on this issue, involving scholars, involving community leaders, traditional leaders, and discuss these issues. We come from societies where discussing issues, even the most sensitive issues, is a tradition. Instead of looking to Europe or Western Europe or United States, we should look deep inside ourselves and look for solution. Will Somalia re-emerge as a Somali nation state? I doubt it. But there has to be a state that satisfies the needs, the cultural, linguistic, and material needs of the Somali society, that within the context of creating bodies within the Horn of Africa region.
Sharing resources among neighboring countries is global experience, including seaports. Why are such initiatives discouraged or denounced when it comes to Africa and other developing countries?
It is strange, it is absurd that something that happens regularly elsewhere, when it happens in Africa, becomes an issue. For example, as I've said before, ports are idle in the Horn of Africa. And ports have become commodities for sale. DP World has already, I think, bought or leased Barbara. It at one time tried to buy even the port of Los Angeles in the United States. Instead of just tolerating this, I think a Horn-wide corporation for the management and development of ports, for the benefit of all societies, should be adopted in the Horn of Africa. I think the Horn is ripe for that.
Well, since Ethiopia has officially expressed its interest to get sea outlets, this is from its neighboring countries, all media speculations were focusing on Eritrea. Why has Ethiopia prioritized Somaliland over other ports?
Frankly, this question should be addressed to government officials, but we can speculate. So I speculate that it is because of prior sounding out. I don't think the memorandum of understanding just dropped out of blue sky. I think there were exploratory discussions prior to the signing of the memorandum of understanding. And Ethiopia had access to the sea, to the Red Sea, prior to the independence of Eritrea. When Ethiopia raised the issue of access to the sea, people assumed automatically that it should be some port of Eritrea, particularly Assab. But I think the Ethiopian leadership was already thinking about renting, leasing a port from Somaliland. And I don't see why it is such a big deal. There are claims that it violated Somalia's sovereignty. But is Somalia sovereign when its own government is being protected by foreign troops? You just don't take one word out of a series of concepts that legitimate a state and then focus on that. So I think the memorandum of understanding did not violate Somalia's sovereignty because it was non-existent anyway.
Due to the increasing geopolitical importance of the Horn of Africa, several global powers are expanding their military bases on the region. Insecurity on the safety of Red Sea is also growing since recently. What is your advice to leaders of the Horn of Africa to keep their collective peace?
I am concerned when foreign powers start building bases in the neighboring countries. It is not to protect us, it is to protect their own interest that they are building these bases, military bases. And leaders should be very wary of leasing out territory for military purposes to foreign powers.
Integrating Africa starts from integrating neighboring countries and regional groups. In this regard, how are the countries in the Horn of Africa doing so far?
There is a lot of talk about regional integration, but the details are unknown, have not been worked out. As I said before, regional integration in the Horn of Africa will be very different from regional integration in other African subregions. For this, I think it is immediately necessary to create a regional integration center and define what we mean by regional integration, what elements should be pursued to implement regional integration in the Horn of Africa. I believe, for example, regional integration rarely expresses itself in concrete terms. For example, there are cross-border languages like Somali. I think an institute for the promotion and development of Somali language and literature should be created at the Horn level and be situated somewhere on the border of what is today Somalia and Ethiopia, somewhere, so as to work as a linkage between Ethiopian Somalis and Somalis from other regions. The same thing can happen for Afar, the same thing can happen Tigrinya. This level of detailed regional integration has to be worked out. And for this, there has to be deliberation, not only involving politicians, but also political theorists and intellectuals and common people.
What do you think kept Somaliland from getting international recognition as a sovereign state for the last 30 or so years?
I think there is always the negative appreciation of this neglect. But I think it has a positive implication. The positive implication has avoided the notice of many observers. This quite often in Africa, while we pursue international external legitimacy, we forget the internal legitimacy. What will happen after recognition is yet to be seen. If they go back to emphasizing external legitimacy at the expense of internal legitimacy, then the problem will restart. So it's unfortunate that Somaliland did not gain international legitimacy until now. But from now on, I think groups that will recognize Somalia will continuously increase.
News is coming out that some countries from the West were willing to push for the recognition of Somaliland even decades ago, and just recently some UK members of Parliament have openly advocated for the UK to join Ethiopia in recognizing Somaliland's sovereignty. What is your reflection on this?
Well, the major obstacle is the African Union because most states are concerned that the African Union will object to the recognition of Somaliland for a number of reasons, most of them fake. For example, most African countries have agreed that the borders they inherited at the time of independence should be maintained. Somaliland became independent from Britain, and the borders were set by under British colonial rule, and it does not violate this. But any tinkering with existing states is considered a possibility to open the Pandora's box, and therefore is feared most probably by the African Union.
Honorable Mr. Lencho Lata, thank you for your precious time and deep analysis. Dear our esteemed audience, this is the end of our program. Thank you for watching.